the U.S. can cut its reliance on China for critical materials. Pini Althaus is CEO of Cove Capital. Hello, Pini.
Hi, Robert. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you very much for sitting down with me on this today. Pini, what just happened in China in early December with regard to new bans on the export of critical minerals?
Well, China has now banned three minerals in particular that are required for the manufacturing of chipsets and semiconductors, which of course has become sort of the new frontier in terms of development of advanced technology, artificial intelligence, etc., and very much sort of the engine behind a lot of applications we have today. So it's left the US in a very precarious position. However, we shouldn't be surprised by this. This has been something that a number of us have been discussing and talking about for some time now.
We have been talking about that for some time now. And we're just wondering, though, with regard to this particular action of China, what are the immediate ramifications that you see for the U.S. as a result of this ban by China?
Yeah, so this could spread to a number of industries, of course, talking about chipsets and semiconductors. And we've already seen the Chinese government launching a antitrust investigation into NVIDIA with regards to antimony, which was one of the key materials needed for the development of chipsets. But you know, with the reduction of the export of a number of critical minerals, not just this past week, but also in August of this year and in August of 2023, these will affect industries like the defense manufacturing companies, the military industrial complex, as they call it. This will trickle down to the automotive sector. There are a number of critical minerals required to manufacture electric vehicles, for example. And the question is this the beginning of the banning of more materials for export from China to the United States? But you know, in any which way, we need to have our own independent supply chain for all industries that utilize critical minerals.
Well, it certainly is the latest in a long series of wake-up calls we've had on this issue. And so maybe this will be the one that actually spurs us into action. But before we even talk about our domestic production, are there not alternatives elsewhere? What about Australia? What about Canada? And what about the U.S. role in C5+1, the group of Central Asian countries who have critical minerals mining capability? Why can't we turn to them?
Yeah, good question. So we definitely have to have a collaboration with countries like Australia and Canada. However, you know, and I've been sort of writing about this for some time now. To have a sole reliance on countries like Australia and Canada is not a strategy. And very simply, the reasons are that Australian and Canadian companies have no regulations like we have in the United States, like CFIUS, where there are restrictions on exporting critical minerals to China, for example. So many, if not most, Australian rare earth companies, for example, have offtakes in place already with Chinese companies. And a number of lithium projects in development in Australia have offtakes also with Chinese companies. So the point of having a collaboration with Australia is only if there's some aspects of that collaboration that require materials from Australian projects to be sold into the US or the Western supply chain. And in fact, last week, the Australian government provided $400 million of funding to a rare earth refinery for Iluka Resources. And my understanding is that there was a no China clause in that funding. So I think more of this type of regulation, if you will, or conditions precedent for tax grants, R&D rebates, etc., by the Australian government, and also similarly by the Canadian government, who are also giving a lot of tax incentives to critical mineral development companies. I think that's the way that this needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. And in Central Asia, another possibility there too?
Yeah, so President Biden in September of 2023 entered into the critical mineral dialogue with the C5 or the C5 countries, the Middle Corridor countries, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan. And these countries host a significant amount of critical minerals. And to date, you know, primarily China and to some extent Russia have been developing projects in the region. And these countries, as I mentioned, host not just significant materials that are relevant to advanced manufacturing, etc., They host a lot of different materials like uranium, etc. But for the purpose of critical minerals, we've started to see reform in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, reform to their mining codes to make it more friendly for Western companies to go into these countries and develop projects. So Cove Capital, my company, for example, went in early 2023 in anticipation of such agreements, and also after the signing of an initial agreement between the United States and Kazakhstan to collaborate on critical minerals. And we became the first, and I believe only company right now, US company to date, that has critical minerals licenses. And we're developing several projects which include lithium, beryllium, tantalum, niobium, rare earths, etc. We have a joint venture with Talkun Samruk, which is a state-owned mining company in Kazakhstan, to develop this state-owned rare earth project there. And we're in similar discussions now with the government of Uzbekistan. And if you look at a country, for example, like Tajikistan, I mean, it's the third largest exporter of antimony. So we have no choice. We have to start looking to this region. But I would say even expanding beyond this region, countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo host some of the most significant deposits of critical minerals, including copper, cobalt, lithium, etc. And the United States has not really done much at all. And that's sort of given a free rein to China to operate in these countries. And we're hearing sentiment from the DRC and from a number of African countries that they would like to see US engagement there, and would take measures to make it easier for US companies to operate in the region.
Of course, there are complications there involving the possibility of conflict minerals as well that we have to deal with going forward. But even with this in mind, Pini, I mean, these sound like very positive moves to diversify our source of these critical materials. But I'm sure you would agree with me that the answer does not lie entirely in just depending on alternative countries to China, that we ourselves must have some kind of domestic capability building up here as well. If that is the case, what progress, if any, has the U.S. made toward that end as developing its own domestic source of rare earth and other types of critical materials in recent years?
Yeah, you're quite right, Robert. So again, if we're relying on foreign countries, that's not an exclusive option. We have to have an independent critical mineral supply chain, which means developing projects domestically. And the biggest issue facing projects today is twofold. One, the permitting process. So the United States, it can take 7 to 10 years, in fact, sometimes 15 years, to permit a project to enable it to go into production. And this is among the longest globally in terms of delays in obtaining permits, and investor sentiment is not favorable at all toward investing in domestic production because of the permitting delays. So there have been measures, for example, the FAST-41, which President Trump dealt with in his first administration, and there have been some efforts in the Biden administration to try to streamline the permitting process. But the problem is it's not enough. Not enough has been done. And we also have NGOs and others that file frivolous lawsuits against mining projects. Intelligence reports have indicated that a lot of these lawsuits have been funded by the CCP. And ironically, a lot of these groups that are funding lawsuits against critical minerals projects are the ones calling for electrification of vehicles in general and for the green revolution, etc.
Which
So
requires these minerals in order to be
that's right.
to be
So we
developed.
can't have our cake and eat it. And to use the logic, well, let's get our materials from China. A, we've seen what China has done with the control they have on critical minerals. And B, by China's own admission, they don't mine or process these materials in an environmentally friendly way. So to say, well, let the Chinese sort of destroy everything ecologically there, affect the populations around their mines and processing facilities, and then bring those materials back here to put into a Tesla really doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think the approach has to be to streamline permitting, do away with the frivolous lawsuits. There are a number of mechanisms like the FAST-41. And then the second challenge we have in this country is the development of deposits themselves. So from a top-down approach, you'll have a few projects, lithium projects, maybe a couple of rare earth projects in the next 10 years going into production in the United States, not much else. The problem is the United States doesn't have a junior resource sector like Australia or Canada has. And so we need to start incentivizing exploration in the United States. And one of the ways to do that might be to look at flow-through shares, similar to what Canada had enacted a number of years ago, to provide tax incentives for those investing in early stage exploration companies into what we call the juniors. But if we don't take a bottom-up approach, we won't have projects that will be taken into development in 10 or 15 years from now. So we'll be sitting here having the same conversation.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a bottom-up, a top-down, and then, of course, the processing capabilities. So China controls, let's call it, only 60% of critical minerals globally, but they control 85% of the processing capability. So that needs to be undertaken is a very dramatic step toward making the US a lead, if you will, or at least on par with China as far as the ability to process critical minerals. And there are a number of ways for the US to go about doing that.
Well, even beyond that, Pini, you have explained to me in the past that the critical mineral supply chain is really quite complex. Definitely more than mining, it's processing, it's metals and alloys production, and it's magnet manufacturing. Can all of those things be located domestically in the US, or are we going to have to rely on other countries for at least some of those processes going forward?
There's no question in my mind that this can be hosted in the United States. This can be developed in the United States. There are already a couple of magnet manufacturing plants in the US that are about to go into production. There are a number that will be coming into production in the next few years. Magnet manufacturing is not rocket science, although some people tend to think it is. Processing is more difficult. However, the technology is there already in the West. There are a number of initiatives in many different Western countries around processing. But I think between the capability of the national labs and public-private cooperation, there's no question in my mind that within a few years, the United States can be up to the level of China, not necessarily in terms of quantity, but in terms of the ability to process materials. Metals and alloys is already something that's known. There are already companies doing this in the United States. There are companies doing this in the UK and elsewhere. So all of these things can be brought to bear in the United States. It's just going to take an effort to do it, and it's going to take a coordinated effort. And I think it's going to require a private-public partnership to achieve that.
Pini Althaus of Cove Capital, I want to thank you so much for continuing this conversation on the critical mineral supply chain and what the U.S. needs to do so that we're not having exactly the same conversation 1, 2, 3, and 4 years in the future from now. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Robert. I like talking to you, but I'd like to talk to you about what we've achieved the next time we chat.
We're definitely going to have that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.